In the second year after our divorce and separation, Orion committed suicide upon learning the news of my remarriage. He set fire to everything in his residence. All that was left was a snowflake specimen he had made with his own hands during a scientific expedition to Antarctica that year. It was the first time I noticed that there were densely packed words engraved on that specimen. My beloved Aria, may you be safe and happy. Yet, during these 3 years, I had been tormenting him. In the blink of an eye, I found myself back on the day he gave me the specimen. Orion was a student sponsored by my father. He managed to get into Lynn University from a small mountain village and eventually became my father's doctoral student. He was silent, introverted, sensitive, and excellent. However, I disliked him the most. I hated that he made me look like a good-for-nothing playboy. My father treated him much better than he treated me. Later, Orion had an accident and lost the use of one of his legs. My father felt sorry for him and forced me to marry him. During the 3 years of our marriage, I spoke harshly to him, and we grew to loathe each other. Yet, he maintained the image of a good husband, showing me extreme tolerance and patience, and he never once spoke a harsh word to me. Later, I took pleasure in tormenting him. Knowing that his leg was not in good condition, I still made him run to a supermarket 3 blocks away to buy strawberries in the freezing cold. Every time the wind blew or it rained, and his leg injury flared up, causing him to lie in bed in great pain, I would just stand by and stare at him indifferently. Sometimes, when we were walking side by side on the road, I would deliberately quicken my pace and leave him behind. Then, I would look at his clumsy walking posture triumphantly, and taunt him for being a lame man who couldn't walk fast. I admit that these were all despicable means for me to resist this marriage. Later, Orion finally agreed to divorce me in the 3rd year of our marriage. I had always thought that divorce would be a relief for both of us. After all, he didn't love me that much either. But I never expected that. In the 2nd year after the divorce, upon learning the news of my remarriage, he chose to commit suicide. In a flash, Orion was standing in front of me again, carefully holding a small box in his hands. On New Year's Eve of this year, my father knew that he was all alone, so he invited him to our home for the New Year's Eve dinner. He was sensible and well-behaved, and he prepared gifts for everyone in the family. For me, it was a snowflake specimen brought back from Antarctica. It was a perfect star-shaped snowflake, with clear and smooth crystal edges. Under the light, it looked like a translucent star. Making such a specimen requires a great deal of patience and carefulness. And it is even more difficult to find such a perfect star-shaped snowflake. In my previous life, after I received the gift, I casually threw it into the trash can. Because I disliked Orion and hated that he always hypocritically ingratiated himself with my family. I hated everything he gave me. But for some reason, when I thought of his death in this life, my heart tightened. A numb, dull pain swept through my body, and it seemed that there was a faint ache deep in my heart. I subconsciously took the box and said, "Thank you, my younger brother." Flynn was flipping through a set of notes that Orion had given him, and his eyes were filled with disdain. "Just a few old books. You have the nerve to give them as a gift." My father slapped my brother on the head. "You brat. What are you talking about? Those are the top students' notes. Others can't buy them even if they have the money. Go back and study hard." After that, he gave me a fierce glare. If you 2 siblings were half as excellent as Orion, I would be much more at ease. My younger brother also disliked him. He always felt that Orion stole the limelight that should have been his as a son. However, Flynn was naturally a fool. In his previous life, he couldn't study well. Later, with my father's connections, he got a staff position with a formal establishment at a university. He caused trouble frequently, and it was Orion who often went to clean up his mess. As for me, in order to oppose my father and not take over his career, I secretly changed my college application and studied medicine, which has always been a great regret for my father. No wonder my father liked Orion so much and wholeheartedly cultivated him as his successor. Who wouldn't like someone who is smart, sensible, and obedient? The reunion dinner had a strange taste. When Orion stood up, I subconsciously looked at his leg. Oh right. At this moment, he wasn't lame yet. And muscular lines were faintly visible under a thin pair of sweatpants. The pants were a bit short. And when he sat down, his well-defined ankle bones were exposed. Orion retracted his feet somewhat awkwardly. Only then did I notice that there was a big hole in his sock. He gritted his teeth and said in a low voice, "Have you seen enough?" Orion's ears turned red. He thought I was making fun of him and seemed a bit angry and embarrassed. I withdrew my gaze and then casually got up and went to Flynn's room to find 2 boxes of new socks. When Orion was about to leave, I secretly stuffed them into his bag. My father is a rough man. He usually cares about Orion and often buys clothes for him. But he doesn't know to buy some close-fitting clothes. When I returned to my room, I opened the gift. At this time, there were no words like "my beloved Aria. May you be safe and happy" on the snowflake specimen. It should have been that he secretly engraved them after we got married in the previous life. I really couldn't figure out why. Even though we were a couple full of resentment, he still looked so deeply in love. However, since I've been given a chance to start over, I must change our destiny. In the previous life, after Orion had an accident and became lame, my father was worried that he would end up alone for the rest of his life. So he forced me to marry him. Then, in this life, all I need to do is to make sure he stays safe and sound. The next day, it snowed heavily in Linju. After I finished my shift, I went to the school to find my father. I happened to run into Orion coming out of the laboratory. He was wearing very thin clothes. And when he was going down the stairs, he stumbled and almost fell. That little stagger almost scared me to death. "You're old. We Cleggs can't afford to have any more problems." Actually, I intended to go over and help him. But I didn't expect that I was in such a hurry that I did a sliding tackle and knocked him down to the ground. I kicked him 4 or 5 meters away. Orion turned his head and looked at me in disbelief. "Sorry. I'm really sorry." I tried to get up from the ground. But unfortunately, the box of men's underwear in my bag fell out. Orion's eyes instantly turned cold. "Aria, this is a school. Don't be so blatant." I admit that I did have a lot of hooligan-like behaviors. For example, I had been flirting with the junior apprentice in their laboratory before. Occasionally, I also peeked at those male college students playing basketball in the small forest and admired their muscular lines. But that was all. And I never did anything else out of line. I struggled to get up from the ground. "This is for you." His face turned red instantly. "I don't want it. This pair of underwear was stolen by me from my younger brother Flynn's room. Don't worry. It's clean and brand new. No one has ever worn it." I forcefully stuffed it into his arms. And he pushed me away. Blushing. "I really don't need it. Don't be shy. It's nothing. Doesn't my father always buy things for you too?" Some people passed by on the roadside and looked at us. Orion awkwardly turned sideways to block me. And his suppressed voice revealed surging emotions. "It's too small. It's not my size." I thought about Flynn's skinny body like a bee in coal, and subconsciously looked at Orion's lower body. Well, it was indeed too small. "Then you wait. I'll steal my father's for you later." I turned to leave. But Orion grabbed my arm. "Aria, don't make fun of me." There was a hint of shame and anger on Orion's fair face that was tinged with red. His knuckles, which were red from the cold, were clasped around my wrist. And there were faintly a few patches of frostbite on them. I took off my gloves and put them on his hands. "I'm not making fun of you. I just want to atone for my sins. After all, in the previous life, my actions indirectly led to his suicide." I remembered that on the 7th day after his death in the previous life, a student came to burn paper for him and loudly questioned me in the morning hall why I was so cruel. That was the first graduate student that Orion had mentored after he became a professor in the previous life. The other person cried bitterly in the morning hall, saying that I was a heartless bad woman. "Orion loved you so much. Even before he died, he was afraid that you would have a difficult life in the future. So he wrote a will saying that he would leave all his property to you. He committed suicide only after he watched you announce your wedding news and found your new home. Don't you know that at all?" Orion had been suffering from depression for many years. And all of this was because of you. These words kept whirling in my ears. And my thoughts were instantly pulled back to reality. At this moment, Orion was standing in front of me, with his eyes lowered, and I didn't know what he was thinking. Could it be that he had already fallen in love with me from this moment? I tentatively carefully. Orion. Do you like? Before I could finish my sentence, his junior apprentice came out of the laboratory. He waved at me excitedly from a distance. The gentle look in Orion's eyes immediately turned cold. I won't disturb you to catching up. I'll be leaving now. After saying that, he left without looking back. Sister Aria. Why are you here? Do you want to go to the movies together? Or we can go shopping in the afternoon. Didn't you always say you wanted to buy a necklace? I didn't have much patience and dismissed him, saying, I'm not going. I'm not in the mood. The junior apprentice spouted and said, Did my senior brother say something he shouldn't have again? Don't pay attention to him. He's just a taciturn person. Maybe he's been busy preparing for the scientific expedition recently. So he's in a bad mood. That's right. I remembered. In the previous life, Orion had the accident during this scientific expedition. During that scientific expedition to Antarctica, I went with the medical team and encountered an avalanche at the same time as the scientific research team. Although everyone was eventually rescued, only Orion's leg was left disabled, and he could no longer walk normally after that. So, in this life, I must ensure his safety before the disaster occurs. The junior apprentice waved his hand in front of me. Sister Aria. Why do you seem a bit absent-minded? It's nothing. I'm leaving now. On the day the scientific research team set off, besides the basic protective clothing, Orion was only wearing a thin inner garment. I stuffed a thick bag of hand warmers into his hands. Use these to keep warm. The junior apprentice sitting behind saw this, and said pitifully, Sister Aria. I want some too. I looked at him. Dressed like a big eater. And refused. You're dressed like Buzz Lightyear. You're not cold. When I turned my head, I saw a trace of a smile flashing in Orion's eyes in the reflection of the bus window. But soon, without a low sigh, he composed himself and pretended that nothing had happened. On the third day, we arrived at the scientific research camp. At night, I secretly sneaked into Orion's room. Inside here are knee pads and some personal items. You can use them. Don't worry. This time they're all in your size. He picked up the box of underwear, and his fair face turned red again. He quickly stuffed it back. He said softly, Thank you. I never realized before that Orion was such a shy person. Perhaps it was because during the 3 years of our marriage in the previous life, my feelings for him were always so complicated that I never paid attention to what kind of person he was. I just kept hurting him and trampling on him to gain the pleasure of revenge. Thinking of this, I suddenly felt a bit uncomfortable. I tried to recall and then admonished. The weather station said there might be a heavy snowstorm the day after tomorrow. You must be careful when you go out. Please. Please don't have an accident. I see. Orion has always been very obedient, listening to my father and also listening to me. I gently pounded him on the shoulder and said with satisfaction, No wonder my dad likes you. You're really well behaved. The voltage at the research station is unstable. And the lights are dim. When the light shines on his face, a row of fine eyelash shadows falls. Orion is very tall. When I look up at him, for a moment, my heart skips a beat. Observing him in this life without any biased emotions, his naturally beautiful appearance is enough to captivate people's hearts. The next second, the lights suddenly go out. Orion instinctively hugs me, and one hand protects the back of my head. Outside the window, there is the sound of a snowstorm raging. A voice comes from the walkie-talkie, saying that there is a problem with the generator and the power supply will be suspended for 10 minutes. Leaning against his solid chest, I asked, Orion, you must have exercised a lot, right? He didn't say anything, just silently let go of his hands, pretending to be scared. I threw myself into his arms again. The wind outside is so strong. Will there be polar bears around? Polar bears are really scary. He thoughtfully wrapped a blanket around me, then bent down and said, Aria, This is the Antarctic. There are no polar bears. Straight men are just straight men, lacking in sensitivity to emotions. In the next few days, I kept a close eye on the weather conditions and also closely watched Orion. I often got distracted at work, and my eyes would involuntarily follow him. Orion finally couldn't stand it anymore. He came over during dinner in the evening and reminded me. Could you please stop staring at my legs? Are you wearing knee pads? Yes. Let me check. Before he could dodge, I squatted down and felt that he was indeed wearing them properly. Then I felt relieved. In case something happens next, it's better to have some protection. The junior apprentice said sorry. Dr. Shi, could you please care about the lives of us hard workers? In the previous life, he and Orion had always been at odds. Not only did he oppose Orion in scientific research everywhere, but after Orion had an accident and became lame, he often sneered at him for being a cripple. After all, there are some people who know how to play the pity card. Not only does Aria's father show great care for him, but now you, Sister Aria, also care about him in every way. I have to say, men who can show weakness have good luck. I can't do such things. After the junior apprentice finished speaking, he still felt unsatisfied and deliberately said, Orion, why don't you teach me a few tricks on how to please women? Orion kept a straight face and didn't say anything. I stood up first and splashed a glass of water at the junior apprentice who was speaking in a sarcastic way. Stop being jealous. You don't understand him at all. Upon hearing this, everyone looked at me. The junior apprentice also said blankly, Sister Aria, didn't you used to hate him the most? Because my father was always so partial. I really didn't like Orion before, but now it's different. Now I feel guilty. All right. From now on, Orion is under my protection. None of you are allowed to bully him. My old man is the leader of this research group, so everyone gives me some face. As soon as I walked outside the door, I was suddenly pulled by Orion, who caught up from behind. The temperature outside the base is 40 or 50 degrees below zero. There is a mist of water vapor in his rapid breathing. There is white frost on his eyelashes. Orion hesitates, not knowing what to say. What's wrong? Before I could get his answer, Orion suddenly looked in the direction behind me. And his face changed. There was an avalanche. He grabbed my hand and ran quickly towards the safe area. A flurry of thoughts flashed through my mind. In the previous life, he encountered an avalanche while on a mission outside. Why would he be in trouble near the base this time? I clearly have tried my best to save his life. Why does history have to repeat itself? All around is an endless expanse of white, and it's already impossible to tell the directions of the east, south, west, and north. I could only follow him and run randomly. In the last second before the snow came crashing down, Orion protected me under his body. As the world spun around, I heard Orion speaking in my ear. Don't be afraid, I will protect you. I don't know how long it had passed, but I woke up from the intense pain. I was already unable to move under the pressure of the snow, but fortunately, I only suffered some minor skin injuries. However, Orion had completely lost consciousness and couldn't be woken up no matter how I called him. He used his body to block the biggest impact of the avalanche for me. Now he was covered in injuries all over his body. I didn't dare to shout for help loudly, for fear of causing a secondary avalanche. So I could only dig out bit by bit with my hands. In the weather dozens of degrees below zero, soon my hands completely lost their sensation. Orion, you must not die here. I didn't dare to stop for a moment and kept digging at the snow desperately. I don't know how long I had been digging, but Orion slightly frowned and called my name in a hoarse voice. Aria. I'm here. He slightly opened his eyes and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that I was safe and sound. His hands and feet were stiff. I got close to him to keep him warm, but I found that this little bit of heat was completely useless. Fortunately, at this time, the snow loosened, and a little light could gradually be seen. I could only dig even harder, and finally dug him out of the snow pile intact. But only then did I see that his entire left leg was bleeding profusely, and the blood frozen by the low temperature had even formed clumps. My heart sank. Was he going to become lame again just like in the previous life? I dragged him little by little towards the outside. But it was so confusing all around that I couldn't tell the direction at all. Orion propped himself up and endured the pain, saying, "You go. Walk in the direction of the left. You should be able to reach another base. Leave me alone. Otherwise, we'll both die here." I finally couldn't help but start sobbing softly. The guilt from the last time and a sense of powerlessness in this life were mixed together. These two feelings deeply tortured me. Clearly, I wanted to save him. But things just didn't go as I had hoped. "No. I can't leave you behind." I quickly adjusted my emotions, and then dragged him forward again. Under the polar day, it's impossible to tell the difference between day and night. And I don't know how long I had been walking. Fortunately, unfortunately, there is always a way out. Just before I exhausted my strength, I met the large search and rescue team. I finally knelt on the ground and burst into tears. And then my eyes rolled back and I fainted. When I woke up again, I was already on the emergency helicopter. Orion's condition was the most serious, so he was among the first batch to be sent back to Lingier. When I returned to the hospital, he had just finished the surgery and was still in the stage of waking up from the anesthesia. Just like the words used in the previous life. The doctor said in a very regretful tone that his leg was likely to be disabled. The frostbite is too severe and has affected the knee joint. Although the surgery can ensure that he can stand up in the future, it will inevitably affect his walking. My father was extremely distressed and begged the doctor to take another look to see if there was still any hope of salvation. But the doctor just shook his head and advised, "Do the rehabilitation training as soon as possible." My head was buzzing. Why is the ending still the same in this new life? And the ending in this life turned out to be that he became disabled because he saved me. Everything I tried so hard to change has, in the end, become something that I single and Ashen contributed to this outcome. Outside the ward, my father looked haggard. My father has always treated Orion as his own son. Now that he had an accident, my father was even more heartbroken. So, just like in the previous life, my father said the same thing. "If Orion's leg becomes disabled, the best way is for you to marry him and take care of him for the rest of his life. Aria, you are a doctor. Dad can rest assured that you will take care of him." The ridiculous thing is that, compared to the hysterical rejection in the previous life, this time I just remained silent in this life. After all, he was injured while saving me. My father said earnestly, "Orion is a good boy. He won't let you down." The person on the hospital bed slightly frowned. As he woke up from the anesthesia, he slowly opened his eyes. "Father of Aria, don't force her." Orion was very weak. The first words he said were to ask not to force me to get married. This was completely opposite to his reaction in the previous life. In the previous life, he silently accepted this marriage and had endured my torture for 3 years. But in this life, when I was willing to accept the marriage under great guilt, he went back on his word. My father comforted him. "Orion, in every aspect, you are worthy of Aria. Don't have any psychological burden. Your teacher will definitely find the best doctor and use the best medicine for your leg. Moreover, you saved Aria, and she should compensate you." Orion gently shook his head. "It was my willing choice." The sudden change caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say for a moment. My father gave me a fierce look and then sighed and turned to leave. This sudden accident in the research team caused Orion to be injured, so the whole research group suspended its work. In the next few days, I spent every day in the hospital and went to the ward to accompany Orion after work, but his attitude towards me became colder and colder, and he even reached the point of avoiding me. In the previous life, even though I tortured him repeatedly, he never complained. But in this life, he not only refused to marry me but also treated me extremely unfairly. Orion's rehabilitation was not easy. Because his knee was seriously injured, even simple actions like bending over and squatting down were very difficult for him. He fell down again and again in the rehabilitation room and then struggled to get up. When I went up to help him, he just pushed me away coldly. "I'm not a cripple. I can get up by myself." The veins on his arms bulged. He held the walking aid and got up with difficulty, but soon fell down heavily again. I couldn't bear it and stepped forward to support him. Orion. Let's get married. Since I owe him after all. Let me pay off my debt. But the moment I said I wanted to get married, there was a cold determination in his eyes. Aria. I don't need your pity. It turned out that in his eyes, my proposal of marriage was just out of pity. Blood seeped out from the wound on his knee, staining the gauze red. The nurse rushed in and blamed me. Why didn't you keep an eye on him? The wound has split open. It needs to be sewn up again. And he'll have to suffer another time. My father came to the hospital and saw the situation and also blamed me. It's okay if you used to look down on him. But can't you treat him well at a time like this? I felt a mix of emotions in my heart. Orion. Orion. It's really hard to guess what's on your mind. But I have no other strong points except for being thick-skinned. So I patiently went to see him every day. When Orion didn't talk to me, I would stubbornly stick around and chat about all sorts of things. When he was doing rehabilitation exercises, I would stay by his side to cheer him on. Sometimes he thought I was too talkative and couldn't help frowning. He still had such good manners that he couldn't bring himself to say a harsh word. Gradually, his leg had regained its walking function. But he still limped obviously. After returning to the laboratory, the junior apprentice always gossiped about him behind his back, saying that my father was partial and actually suspended the experimental progress of the entire research group for him. When I heard this, I rushed up to argue. Don't you have a clue why it was suspended? You guys' scientific research projects all depend on Orion leading them. And he also revised your papers word by word. Don't act like you're being wronged when you'd actually benefited. The junior apprentice didn't dare to offend me and just said sarcastically, Sister Aria, don't tell me you actually like this disabled person? Yes, let out a low sigh. I do like him. I answered affirmatively without hesitation. Orion's pupils shrank slightly, and a trace of shock flashed in his eyes. But soon, he regained his usual indifferent expression. In the following days, I picked him up and sent him to and from the laboratory every day. And I found the best rehabilitation doctor for him. My father was very pleased and kept praising me for being sensible. My younger brother Flynn, however, couldn't understand. Sister, didn't you dislike him the most before? Why are you being nice to him now that he's lame? How should I explain it? The belated heartbeat and the love that came too late. Since I intervened in the cause that affected him, I naturally have to accept the consequences. In our previous life, it was a one-sided torment from me to Orion. Now in this life, it has turned into compensation. His love for me from beginning to end has exchanged for an unending entanglement of fate. Probably. It's like that. 10 Because of his inconvenient legs and feet, he moved out of the dormitory building and rented an apartment outside the school. I went to deliver food to him after work. Unexpectedly, it happened to be a heavy rainstorm in Linju that day. When I walked out of the hospital holding an umbrella, I almost got blown away together with the umbrella. With great difficulty, I managed to reach downstairs of his apartment, and I was completely soaked like a drowned rat. From a distance, I saw Orion waiting for me downstairs with a single crutch. Half of his body was wet from the rain. When he saw my embarrassed appearance, he immediately tilted the umbrella towards me. Then he said with a cold face, You don't have to deliver food to me in the future. Ordering takeout is the same for me. After that, he took out a set of clean clothes from the wardrobe and told me to change into them so as not to catch a cold. When I came out, he was boiling ginger soup, and the whole room was filled with the aroma of brown sugar. Suddenly, my nose twitched with a pang of sadness. In the previous life, he took care of me like this after we got married. Once, during a rainy day when I had my period and had a stomachache, he was also suffering from joint pain. But he still went to the kitchen to boil ginger soup for me. But I just knocked over that bowl and told him to get lost. He didn't say anything and managed to kneel down halfway to clean up the debris on the floor. Later, I found out that on that day, he took a lot of medicine to suppress the pain. It wasn't just the physical pain but also the pain in his mind. But I had never paid attention to what was in that drawer full of medicine. It was only after he died and I saw his electronic medical records that I understood. There was a fixed stack of depression diagnosis certificates in it. Perhaps Orion was never happy when he married me. Thinking of this, I felt very upset. The most tormenting thing in love is that the time of falling in love is not in sync. When he fell in love with me, I spoke harshly to him. And when I fell in love with him, he kept his distance. 11. I walked into the kitchen. Orion was carefully blowing on the hot air. Then he brought the soup out. Drink it while it's hot. I drank the ginger soup in silence. And he leaned on the sofa and wiped my hair for me. I don't know why. But the more I drank, the sadder I felt. And my tears fell straight into the bowl. He sighed helplessly. Are you cold? I'll go turn on the air conditioner. No. I held his hand and turned my head to find that we were almost face to face. So, on an impulse, I kissed him. Orion didn't push me away and let me do as I pleased. He retreated as I advanced, testing the depth of our love step by step. Finally, having fulfilled, I let him pin me down on the sofa and asked him with red eyes if he liked me. Orion turned his head away and didn't look at me. Only his bright red earlobes revealed his obvious feelings. I kissed his Adam's apple. His suppressed, broken voice spilled out from between his lips and teeth. Aria. Don't do this. I'm a man. Then prove it. He turned over and pinned me down underneath him, gritted his teeth and said, I'm not a promiscuous person. No matter what reason you have for teasing me, I won't do such a thing with you. No matter what the reason is? What if I say I love you? Orion has always been a child who lacks love. Anyone who is kind to him can get double the love in return from him. But his pride doesn't allow anyone to pity or sympathize with him. In the previous life, I hated marrying him. Even though I tortured him in every way, he could still tolerate me. It was only later when he found that I really couldn't fall in love with him that he chose to divorce me. But in this life, if I marry him out of pity and guilt, it's something he absolutely can't stand. Orion's breathing became rapid, as if he was savoring the words I just said over and over again. After a long while, he said in an almost pleading tone, Aria, please don't make fun of me. Okay? I raised my head and kissed him. Our lips and teeth intertwined, and the surging sea of desire was suppressed by our consciousness. A child who lacks love is always careful even when loving someone. 12. Orion. I'm sincere. In the previous life, his love that he never expressed was engraved on that snowflake specimen bit by bit. 3 years of marriage had worn away all his love. Later, after we got divorced, upon learning the news of my remarriage, he resolutely chose to commit suicide. Orion's student once said that his teacher would always stare blankly at that snowflake specimen when he couldn't fall asleep at night. Even on the day of our divorce, when I celebrated noisily, he just gave me a faint smile. He was glad to set me free. Later, when I decided to remarry and even posted the invitation card in my WeChat moments with my own hands, it became the last straw that broke the camel's back. Orion's student accused me of being heartless. The teacher's depression was already very serious. But he still couldn't rest assured about you, and often secretly went to the hospital to see if you were doing well. Later, when he learned the news of your remarriage, he thought that someone would take care of you, so he could leave the world without worry. He didn't want you to feel guilty. So he burned everything, including all his medicine and paper medical records. If no one had told me, if it hadn't been for that snowflake specimen, I'm afraid I would never have known. Those days when I took pleasure in tormenting him were filled with pain and the obsession of not wanting to let go for him. His love for me has always been like holding a torch against the wind, with the risk of burning his hands. Thinking of this, a strong wave of discomfort suddenly welled up in my heart. Orion noticed something was wrong, frowned and asked while propping himself up, "What's wrong?" I tried my best to swallow all the bitter emotions. "I just think I was so stupid in the past." He gently tucked the hair beside my ear. "You're very good. I don't deserve you. I didn't deserve you before. And it's even harder for me to deserve you now, Aria." I kissed him, sealing all the words he wanted to say. The sofa was too narrow to move around. He held my waist with one hand and whispered hoarsely in my ear, "Don't regret it." As soon as the word "no" came out of my mouth, he picked me up with one hand and carried me to the bedroom. The curtains in the bedroom were tightly closed, and there was not a ray of light. But the ambiguous and tender atmosphere had almost reached its peak. Orion unbuttoned and his shirt with one hand, revealing his well-defined and attractive abs. All his self-control and restraint crumbled at this moment. My consciousness was dominated by desire and slowly surged towards me like waves. 13 It didn't end until dawn, and I fell asleep deeply in his arms. When I woke up, it was already afternoon. Orion had washed my clothes, dried them, and folded them neatly on the bedside table. He was cooking porridge in the kitchen, and the air was filled with the pleasant aroma of rice. I put on my clothes and went out, coughed lightly, and said, "I'll talk to my father about our marriage. You don't have to worry about anything. I'll make the arrangements." He murmured an okay softly, leaning against the door. I asked him, "When did you start liking me?" Orion was silent for a while and only said, "A long time ago." He was just one of the dozens of out-of-school children sponsored by my father. Every winter and summer vacation, my father would go to the mountains to teach as a volunteer. One year, he took me to that small mountain village. That was the first time I met Orion. He was being bullied by an uncle of the same clan. His parents had died early, leaving him as the only child in the family. So it was taken for granted that he was exploited. His uncle had occupied the family's cultivated land and also led away the only valuable cattle and sheep in the family. At that time, Orion was thin and weak. When he stepped forward to argue, he was pushed down on the ridge of the field. I stepped forward to support him and forced the other party to return the cattle, sheep, and the cultivated land. When his uncle saw that I was just a young girl, he rushed up and tried to hit me. I was 18 years old that year, a black belt in taekwondo, and full of energy. With a slight move, I threw the other party to the ground. Later, my father applied for a subsistence allowance for him in the village and also told the village secretary to take good care of him, which made his life stable. Orion was very smart. He didn't start going to school until he was 12 years old. Although he started late, he finished all the courses in just a few years. Later, with the sponsorship of my father, he was admitted to Lynn University and went all the way to get a doctorate degree. For all these years, what has kept me studying hard and coming to this city is the desire to see you. I felt that I couldn't hold on several times, but I still managed to make it here. Aria, you may have forgotten what happened back then, but I will remember it for the rest of my life. He had been bullied since he was a child. His parents died early, and there was no one to stand up for him. In that small mountain village, there were all kinds of people who flattered the rich and looked down on the poor. So he had suffered a lot of bullying. I didn't expect that such a small thing could make him remember it for a lifetime. That was just a piece of cake. Orion smiled, and his eyes were incredibly gentle. But for me, it's very different. I took out a red velvet box from my bag, and inside were a pair of wedding rings. Then, Leonard, Mr. Orion, would you like to marry me? There was a hint of a smile in his eyes, but the next second, it faded and his expression returned to calm. The porridge in the pot was boiling vigorously. Orion turned off the stove and then took off his apron. Aria, in this life, you have the chance to make a new choice. What did he mean by that? I was reborn. Had he been reborn too? In an instant, the memories from the previous life that hadn't belonged to me flooded into my mind. When the accident happened at the scientific research station that year, my injuries were much more severe than in this life, so I also lost a lot of memories. In fact, his ending hadn't changed because of my intervention. Because in the previous life, he was also injured while saving me and ended up with a permanent disability. It was just that because I couldn't remember, I had been blaming my father for forcing me to marry him and take care of him. He had chosen to endure the torture I inflicted on him for the next 3 years. But he had never told me the reason. Orion was afraid that I would feel guilty. And he was also afraid that I didn't love him but would choose to stay by his side to take care of him. So he was willing to endure torture rather than put me in a dilemma. From my perspective, in this life that I was reborn into, I was here to compensate him. But from his perspective, even though he knew he would end up disabled and suffer a great deal, in this reborn life, he still chose to save me. Was it because he loved me? Orion closed the ring box and said gently, "In the previous life, I was too selfish. I shouldn't have accepted the arrangement of Aria's father and forced you to marry me. Now, you have a chance to choose again." How the hell was I supposed to choose? I had already slept with him. Was I really going to go back on my word? You really haven't improved at all. You were tortured so terribly by me in the previous life, and yet in this life, you're still willing to save me. Orion smiled. It's not that I haven't improved at all. At least this time during the avalanche. You didn't get too seriously injured. Perhaps in his heart, he had rehearsed the scene of saving me countless times. So when the avalanche came this time, he protected me very well. And I only got a few minor cuts and bruises. After all, in the previous life, I completely lost that period of memory due to a concussion. I opened the ring box again. I've made my choice. I want to get married. Orion's eyes were so gentle that they seemed to be filled with tenderness. Okay. Never go back on our word. Just like in the previous life. We held our wedding in March when the flowers were in bloom and the weather was warm. At the wedding, my father had tears in his eyes and kept holding Orion's hand tightly. For a moment, it was hard to tell whose biological father he really was. Orion's leg was still disabled, and it was especially noticeable when he walked. But in this life, I won't let him bear all the hardships alone. We will have a long and wonderful life together. The end.